All right, this is Tim Cain, Encumbrance Part 2. He released a Part 2 for this. We've reacted to Part 1. I think I'll put that below the channel if you haven't seen that one. I'm sure I turned that into an hour-long video, so let's see if we can turn this into an hour-long video as well. Encumbrance Part 2.
Hi everyone, it's me,
Hi,
Tim.
Tim.
Today I want to talk about encumbrance again. So this is encumbrance part 2.
Okay.
The video, the part 1 video, just called encumbrance, and I'll link it below, generated a lot of really good discussion in the comment section.
It did.
So if you haven't watched it, you probably want to go watch that before you watch this, because I'm going to build on some things from the first part, and I'm not really going to dive into details. So if you haven't watched encumbrance, just stop this, go watch that, and then come back here. The first thing I noticed was a lot of people were saying how I was talking about encumbrance as weight-based. So items had weight, you could only carry a maximum weight.
That's true. You could do like inventory limits, stuff like that.
There were things like perks and attributes that could increase that weight. And they suggested doing it with slots. And there's multiple ways of doing it. I mean, Arcanum had a grid, and you had to fit everything on that grid, and sometimes you had to test things around to get a new object. And there are other games that you have like every item just fits into one slot, and you start with 20 slots. And
I mean, it all serves the same purpose, though, right? You're limiting what the player can hold at any given point, either to help balance out the player's ability to make decisions about their resources, either to balance out the economy in some way so they can't, it limits the amount of, let's just say, gold held at a certain point, right, to be able to sell to a merchant. So it all kind of, or all the above, it serves the same purpose that weight-based encumbrance serves, which is to balance something. And often you do it too for like immersion purposes, so that it doesn't seem weird that the player is able to pick up everything. But it's still one of those things that some players like, some players don't. You can't just remove it in a game that has it, because in a lot of cases the designers have balanced the entire game around the fact that the player's inventory is in some way limited. Which was one of the things that he brought up in the previous video that we talked about, which was, I think he mentioned that a previous boss had said, yeah, can we just remove encumbrance? And it's like, no, we can't just remove encumbrance. Do you know how many things that would affect in the game?
maybe there are bags you can find that increase your slots. Maybe there are perks that say every bag you pick up has 2 extra slots. Whatever it is, my point stands, though, that encumbrance is about imposing an inventory limit about how much the player can carry. So whether you do it with weight or whether you do it with slot, whether it's multiple slots, whether it's slot and weight, those are just limits. So we're still talking about the same thing. It's just, how is your encumbrance set up to limit the number of items that a player could carry at any given point?
Exactly. And I don't think any of his previous points about why it's not that great or why it has a lot of trickle-down effects on the balance, I don't think they're null and void in this case. I'm not a big fan of encumbrance in games, although I don't hate it. I just think that there are ways to do it well, there are ways to do it poorly, there are ways that are still frustrating for the player. So for instance, with Stardew Valley, let's just point out, I'm not a big fan of it. It's pretty easy to upgrade the backpack, but it's not really that fun for me to have a limited space of a backpack in a game that drops a lot of items. And the only thing that's really encouraging me to do is to spend money, so it's a money sink. But it's a money sink that requires you to have pain points with the game first and foremost. And it's something that you often see with a lot of games with perks and things that you can upgrade and things that you can improve about your character to reduce the frustration of other parts of the game. Well, you are purposefully designing frustration in your game and then saying play long enough and you can reduce that frustration. I'm not a big fan of that approach to game design, but I get it, and I've done it myself. The player needs some sort of progression, and the progression needs to feel good, so the easiest way to do it is to impose limits on the player in some way, shape, and form, and then have ways for the player to progress that reduce those limits and frustrations. But you need to know, you need to be conscious as a designer that what you're doing is creating pain points that some players, when they start the game, will be turned off by if there's no way to alleviate it very easily. And equipment and inventory, or let's just say inventory and encumbrance, is one of the most, let's say, modded out or adjusted things in almost every game that has it. When you look at top mods or top fixes, are ways for people to increase carry weight. So, just saying, keep that in mind.
Then several of you said, well, just don't have as many items in the game. You're making this problem yourself by putting in so many items that now you have to invent encumbrance to prevent people from carrying them around.
Yes, but that feels like you're purposefully limiting things as a bandage patch to another problem existing. Like that's one bandage that can be applied that resolves the problem. I won't say fixes the problem. It alleviates the problem. Let's put it that way. Other ways you can do it is to increase stack limits. You can more carefully control how many items the player has available to them in a specific place. I did this in my Darkest Dungeon overhaul. I limited the types of items that can drop in a dungeon to alleviate storage inventory space issues, and I also increased stack limits because I did add more items into the game. So a lot of people complain about Valheim inventory space. I usually just tell them that they should just use portals. The devs originally didn't want portals in the game, but people complained too much, so they added them. Next, they started to complain about inventory. A line has to be drawn somewhere. Yes, I think that it's okay for games to have encumbrance. I just think that the designers need to be aware that the moment they do that, there will be pain points. How can you alleviate pain points? Is it like an ARPG, like a Diablo-like game, Torchlight, whatever, Path of Exile? Do you make it easy for the player to travel back to town? If so, okay, it's alleviated a bit. Do you make items drop a bit more rarer, but make them better, right? So that they don't drop in as many quantities, but they are a bit better items overall. That's one way to help alleviate the problem. Now, the gameplay percentages are how much time is the player spending back in town versus how much time is the player spending out in the maps. And it just increased the map percentage by a bit by lowering the town percentage. So it's like, what are your goals here for the gameplay percentages? How much time do you want the players to spend having to do inventory management? And if that's a part of your game that is relatively significant, over 5%, I would say, then you need to communicate to players that this is something that is expected of them on a reasonable level. Honestly, look at Elden Ring, look at Final Fantasy 16. Just pick shit up, right? And you have a stash that automatically gets refilled if you sleep at a bonfire or something, or at a site of grace. But there's no real limits necessarily. There's no weight limit. Just let the players play,
And let me just say that, well, first of all,
But I still don't hate
there's
it.
a lot of reasons to have a lot of items in the game.
Yes, there is.
A lot of games have character advancement based on items. So the things you buy, your skills, your perks, your attributes, those are part of character advancement, but so are the items you find. You find better weapons, you find better armor, you craft things, you do whatever you want to do. These are all part of making your character better, and these require you to get items. Now,
The variety of items is important too, that it can, variety of items can often be an enabler for different types of playstyles. So again, look at Elden Ring. How many of the items do you actually use in your chat, your guys's Elden Ring builds? Probably you only use at most 10% of the consumables, but you probably have friends, or you've watched streamers or YouTubers play who use other consumables that you don't use. So I don't think that limiting the number of items is necessarily a fix for it because a number of items can also, if they're designed well, can be enablers for different types of builds.
Crafting is an interesting one right there because crafting usually requires you to collect materials. Either you find items and break them down into those materials, or you harvest those materials in the world off of dead bodies or off of plants or off of, ore veins, wherever the materials are that you need. So you need items to either break down into crafting materials, or you need to harvest and collect crafting materials, which is items that go in your inventory. Another thing that people often overlook about items, though, is items are very much a lore delivery vehicle.
That's true too.
Outer Worlds was set up that way. It was supposed to be about a future where corporations ran everything and just deluged everyone in that society with tons and tons of things to buy. So it would be weird if there was no things like that to buy. If you're living in a society that tells you that there's a huge amount of things, but then doesn't let you do it.
Yeah, immersion is a really great point too, as he says here. So there are a lot of games where you can buy, I don't know, you can go sit at a restaurant and you can buy 15 types of food items. And the food items aren't particularly that different from each other in terms of what they do for your character. But some people do role play in these games. They do like that, and they do buy those things just because maybe it's a food that they like, or their character is like only eating one type of food. It's really easy to do. It usually just requires a different sprite and a designer to go through and mess with some values a bit. So it's an easy thing to do. And localization.
Also, the items themselves deliver lore about all the different companies, the different factions, because when you read the lore text on the item, it makes you understand that faction better. So items do a lot more than just make your character advance or, provide bullets for your guns or materials for crafting. They're a lore delivery vehicle. This led to another discussion people were having about why do you have so many useless items in games? And by that, I mean, they were probably thinking of junk items. So Outer Worlds had a category of items called junk. They existed purely to provide lore through their lore text, to have things for you to find in the world that you could convert to money. So everything you found, just like, oh, here's more money. And some of those items could be used as crafting materials. So we've looped back to crafting again.
But I will say, and I'll put Tim on a better freeze frame here. I will say though that I do have a problem with junk items. I think I mentioned this in the last video where, yes, I agree that they can be used for lore purposes. They can exist to dilute pools. They can be used as a way to make additional money. I think that is the most boring usage of junk items, though, in my opinion. I'm okay if they're used as materials in crafting. In my opinion, that doesn't make them junk anymore, right? Or if they're used in specific quests, that doesn't make them junk anymore, right? They have a use beyond just selling and delivering lore to me. There are really good examples of, like, Fallout is a great example, especially Fallout 4, Fallout 76. The junk items you find can be broken down into crafting materials. And oftentimes, especially in Fallout 76, you will want to farm specific locations because they have a much higher amount of a certain material you might be needing to craft with. And that makes them interesting. I think that the more boring examples would be like Star Wars Outlaws, which they're literally just for money, and it's kind of fucking boring. I think that Starfield is another good example where there's just a lot of junk items you can pick up, but they gave them no use, and they're not even worth it for money. They literally just sit on a shelf. You'll never pick it up, and if you do pick it up by accident, you hate the fact that it weighs so much and it was making you encumbered.
Crafting again. Some of the things you find which seem useless aren't. They can be broken down into crafting materials if you do crafting. Now, that's the interesting thing is, what if you don't do crafting? Then those items truly are useless. But once you start to introduce that argument, a lot of other items that are in RPGs that you don't think are useless are completely useless to a certain type of player build.
He means that they're completely useful. So yeah, it's like build enabling items. Again, I don't think that's junk necessarily. I wouldn't classify build enabling items as junk, even though they might be junk to the player. That's an office to break down into lead for bullets. That's one way. Yeah. That's and I think that there is also an extent where if you kind of set up the idea that many small items in your game can be collected, and you have a good chunk of those items that are small, like if you can collect pocket knives in the game and little bottles of plastic, but you can't grab pencils, it kind of seems weird. It's like, well, now I don't know what's grabbable. I can understand that this giant piece of furniture isn't grabbable and it can't be put into my inventory. But it's consistency. That's a good way to put it. Thank you for that word. That's the better way to say it. It's consistency. And some small things, sure, they're junk. They're not really useful. Maybe just don't make them weigh anything. Make them go to a junk thing that you can sell for like a little bit of money. Whatever. Help the player not have pain points where they were trying to pick up all of the ingredients in a bowl in Skyrim and they don't accidentally grab the bowl. Just make the bowl add nothing then, weigh nothing.
For example, if you find scrolls in a fantasy game and you're not playing a wizard or a cleric,
that's not junk items.
Class or subclass.
That's junk.
Those are probably useless.
That's subjectively junk to the player. But that isn't what I qualify as junk as a developer or designer.
Yes, there are a few scrolls that anyone can read, protection scrolls and things like that. But in general, scrolls for non-casting classes are useless. If I'm playing a fighter, I don't know what to do with these scrolls. Similarly, there are a lot of games that have weapons that are class restricted or attribute restricted or skill restricted. And if I don't have those prerequisites, that item is useless to me. Now, yes, again, you can design some games so that if you don't have those prerequisites, you can use the item. It's just much worse in your hands. Like if your strength is below the minimum strength, this weapon doesn't work as well, or this armor causes you to lose, dodging or stealth skill. You can design for it, but most people just don't use those if they don't match the prerequisites.
Yeah, or they just might not. They might just not grab it, or they might, if it's like good weight to value ratio, they might grab it to sell it. So that's okay. That to me, that isn't junk items. That has nothing to do with junk items.
Player characters, those items are useless, even though you don't think of them as useless. Other types of useless weapons is if you've made a very stealthy kind of character and there's a weapon that makes a lot of noise. Like let's say there's a gun that's super loud when you shoot it. You may not want to ever use that gun. That gun is useless for your build. Similarly, like I mentioned, if you're really weak, if you made a character with a low strength, there's going to be a lot of items, whether it's armor, weapons that have min strength,
melee
weapons. You can't use it, or it gives you big penalties for using it. But also that strength may mean you won't want to carry that heavy stuff around because it encumbers you and may slow you down. It may, just by carrying it, or you can't carry it because it fills your inventory. So these are all things that you can try to say, well, let's just get rid of useless items. Useless items is a much bigger term than you're thinking. Or let's get fewer items. Okay, but now what are you going to do about crafting? What are you going to do about delivering lore? And my point here is a lot of these decisions you're making about encumbrance will affect other things in your game.
Yeah, and a lot of times they're just band-aid patches on top of this. It's like, how can we fix encumbrance? And this is one way to make it less annoying, but it will have drawbacks, and it doesn't solve some of the underlying issues that people have with encumbrance. I think as a designer, I would just say, do what you feel is right for your game and for the feeling that players will have, but know that inevitably it will be a pain point for a reasonably large section of your player base. Reasonably large doesn't mean an overwhelming majority, but it just means that it is significant. And understand gameplay percentages. If you have QA testers, if you have play testers, get long clips of them playing, 4+ hours, and just cut the sections of time in an editor of how much time they're spending when they're in inventory menus. doing something with their inventory and see what percentage of that is of the gameplay, because you can easily compare amount of time spent to the 4-hour clip of gameplay. And if it's more than you think it should be, do something simple. Increase the weight or decrease the weight of certain items like junk. You can, of course, adjust value for those junk items based on that. Maybe increase the base capacity for players, but understand that that's going to affect your balance and especially your economy. Anything you do, anything you touch with something that is so core to the game at that point will have an impact on the gameplay, but just be aware of that.
Your UIs will be affected. Your other systems like crafting will be affected.
Yep.
How you deliver lore will be affected. How you do level design will be affected. If you don't have a lot of items you can pick up, why do you have chests and cabinets and bookcases? Are they filled with items that the player can't touch? Which to many players is frustrating. It's like, I can see that can on the table.
Yeah.
Why can't I pick that can up? I see that book in the bookcase. Why can't I pick that book up? So you're making decisions that affect other parts of your game because of how you feel about encumbrance. A lot of people mentioned Bloodlines as being a game that I worked on that had very few items in it, but that's because the player character advancement in Bloodlines is not item based. It is based on, when you go up a level, you put points into different abilities you have, and that's what makes you stronger. And then occasionally you have to drink blood to restore points. Items are not a big thing. You do not become necessarily a better vampire by getting a better gun. Yes, there are guns in the game, and yes, some vampires can use it, but like some vampire builds don't care about guns at all. So it was not predominantly an item based game. So you can make different encumbrance decisions in that game than I could in, say, like Arcanum, where a big chunk of your player build isn't the points you spent in the character, it's the items you're putting on your character. And that choice makes your character better or worse in certain situations. So if you have a whole bunch of advancement decisions tied into items, you're going to want a bunch of different items because people want to make different characters.
He's right.
Boom, you're back to having a lot of items. Now you're going to have to make decisions on how to organize inventory, and encumbrance is one of the choices you can make.
Yeah, I think as Chris says, allowing the player to pick up tons of junk just turns him into a homeless guy recycling aluminum cans for spare change. I mean, you're pretty right about that. Where I will continue to use gameplay percentages as an example here, because it is one of those things where, okay, you have an open world with things to collect, and you want your open world to, let's say Cold and Chronicles, open world to take about 40% of the gameplay, and for alchemy to be about 20%, and then the other 40% to be NPCs, let's just say. So you have that 40% of your gameplay is your open world, where you collect things. What percentage, and now let's assume 100% of the open world gameplay, what percentage of that is spent collecting things? And I think in Cold and Chronicles right now, it is very, very high, because we don't have a lot of variety in the open world. It's too high. It's boring. It's fucking boring, and it's shitty. But that's why we plan to add things to reduce the thing that I think is kind of boring, which is collecting ingredients, where you're just like looking down and you're not enjoying the scenery, you're not engaging with things in the world, you're not being distracted by things that look pretty or look interesting to explore. So at every point, if you think, okay, we want to have a lot of things in the world to pick up, well, now the player is spending a lot of time picking shit up, especially if the player needs to obtain a lot of those items. And the time between advancements, which are your dopamine drops, is going to increase. And if you have too many of those drops and they don't feel that great, like they're 1% boosts in damage, well, now it's like you just have boring progression. You don't have progression with large enough boosts in power for the player to feel like they are, like that point they put in was meaningful. There's encumbrance is just, yeah, encumbrance is one of those things that is so core to progression and can affect so many things that adding it, removing it, modifying it, any of those three things, which are the only three things you can really do with it, can impact the rest of your game in significant ways. I mean, think about right now, if you went to Skyrim and you nerfed player encumbrance by 50%. Well, now it's like all these dungeons that have been designed to provide you with certain amounts of loot. Now, some of those might feel much, much worse because you get halfway through it and you're already over encumbered from on top of the inventory that you have on you. Well, now it's not fun because it's like, okay, well, now I need to jump back out and go store some of this or sell it, or I need to drop things that I have. I always like the inventory Tetris as a way to implement encumbrance without a flat number. Seems more fun to me. I like inventory Tetris. I think we're in the minority mid-drunk. I don't know. It's definitely one of those things that if your game has it, some people will not play your game, and if you have it, some people will play your game. I do like inventory Tetris though. But it still comes down to balancing out like how much inventory Tetris. Do you have an auto sort button? Do you have a way to mitigate some of that? How much loot are you giving out per minute on average? You've not heard these Tetris naysayers? There's quite a lot of them, especially with like Resident Evil or ARPGs especially have them.
So, what's my conclusion on this one, the part 2? Some of you hate encumbrance. You want it gone, and you feel all the arguments made to keep it either aren't valid or can be fixed in other ways. You're not wrong.
People didn't like Diablo's inventory mid-drunk, which is why they went away from a Tetris style to a slot-based style. Like just you pick something up, it takes one slot space. So there are a lot of things that do that too. I think that loot Tetris is inventory Tetris is a bit of a thing of the past, but I still like it.
So, what's my conclusion on this one, the part 2?
Yeah.
Some of you hate encumbrance. You want it gone, and you feel all the arguments made to keep it either aren't valid or can be fixed in other ways. You're not wrong. But some of you love encumbrance and think it's
That's
a valid
subjective.
part of a design. You view it as a challenge or providing a limit to the player, and it's something to work around.
Yes.
People were talking about friction points, and maybe I'll do a video at some point on friction points. But if you make a game that has no friction points, you're basically designing a game where player starts and you hand them all their skills at max and all their attributes max and the best weapon in the game and say, have fun.
He's right. Friction points can be a motivator, but if I call them pain points, but it's the exact same thing. Pain points, friction points, exact same thing here. It all has to do with the user experience. They can be motivators unless they are too frustrating and the ability to mitigate them is too far away. I talked about Stardew Valley and the whole idea of expanding your backpack. The thing is, it is really, really quick to max out your backpack. It really doesn't take a lot of work. But that's also my reasoning for why, well, it doesn't do that much and it's just kind of frustrating to the start of the game, but it is also easy to mitigate. Compare that to something like, I'll just use Throne and Liberty as an example because it's been pissing me off lately. It is so grindy to get a new weapon that it is just not fun. And in order to upgrade to get that weapon, you have to farm so many things and get so many materials. And now you're out of materials to farm your next upgrade for like your weapon or armor. And it's just frustrating. You're incentivized to pay money. And gameplay should be more inherently fun rather than just a carrot on a stick of grind until it becomes fun. But you do need motivators. Tim is right. You need motivators. You do need sometimes that carrot on a stick to say, here's your iron armor. Now go upgrade that to diamonds. Right? You can survive down there a little bit better. Go get your diamonds, get your diamond armor. Now go take your diamond armor into the nether. Go to the fortresses and collect a shit ton of the netherite or whatever the fuck it is. So I don't know. He's right. It's just, it all comes down to balance. How do you balance how frustrating that pain point is and how close the dopamine drop is to that?
Obviously, you do want some friction points. It's your decision on what those friction points are. In the end, encumbrance is a perfect example of a design choice that you as a designer have to make, but no matter how you make that choice, you will not make everyone in the player base happy.
He's right.
No matter how you choose to, whether you have encumbrance or not, if your encumbrance is slot based or weight based or grid based, whether there are attributes or skills or items that change encumbrance, you're not going to make everybody happy. That decision you make will split your audience into people who love it and people who hate it. So you have to choose wisely and understand that that choice you're making affects so many other parts of your game. And this is just encumbrance. Everything you're picking for your game has these interrelated
Yep, they do.
elements that you're going to have to figure out. Encumbrance is just part
Game
of it.
design is hard.
And there is no right answer. So I'm not giving you the right answer. I'm just telling you, decide what kind of game you want to make. Those make your design pillars, and that will help you. That will help inform you what you want to do for encumbrance. Hope this helps.
Another great video by Tim. I think I would say if your game isn't super competitive or it isn't an online game or something, you have two things you can do. Number one, make it easy to mod player inventory, because like he said, you're not gonna be able to please everybody, but you can make your game a bit more accessible to people who want the experience of the game but don't want to have to deal with inventory by making it easy to mod, or just expose this as a gameplay option when the player starts their game. Custom difficulty, player encumbrance, on or off. Simple. Simple and easy to do. Very, very easy. And you know what? Yes, it's going to affect balance in ways, but guess what? Just warn players. Just say, hey, turning this off might make it, affects the balance in some ways, makes it easier to get items, and you'll probably end up generating more money from merchants. We recommend, if you don't want that to happen, to adjust these other values for the, overall value of items or something. Whatever. Just do it the way you want, to let players play the way they want, and you'll make people happy. If you guys want to support Tim, please go give him a subscription. He makes great videos, and give this video a like. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching this one. I think I have enough time to do one more. I'll do it. I'll do one more. So if you're watching on YouTube, we have one more after this. Thank you for watching, and take care.